we'll introduce our first speaker, Jack Markwardt. Jack attended Rutgers University and at Albany Law School. He edited the Law Review and received his Juris Doctor degree cum laude. While practicing law, he researched and authored many Shroud papers, which he presented to various international Shroud symposia. He has appeared on numerous Shroud-related broadcasts, and in 2021, he published his book, The Hidden History of the Shroud of Turin, which details the history of the Shroud from the time when it covered Jesus' crucified body in the tomb to its acquisition by the House of Savoy in the middle of the 15th century. And let's welcome Jack.
My name is Jack Markwardt. I'd like to welcome you all to my presentation. It's called In Defense of Sindonology. I wanted to just very shortly explain how I came to do this presentation. I've been making presentations for over 30 years, and they're always about history. And I have a history presentation I'm going to be doing this afternoon. But this conference was supposed to be a tribute to Barry Schwartz, who I know for 30 years. And I wanted to do like a recount of Sindonology, which I don't know if that's a word that's known by many of you. When I first got involved in 1986, everything was Sindonology. You don't hear the term too much anymore, but as I go through the presentation, it had a special meaning to us who became involved at that time. Like everything else, things have changed in the world, and Shroud studies now are not what they used to be. And so I was preparing to actually do more or less a tribute to Sindonology, which goes back to 1898. And I found out when I do research that a lot of times you start researching something, then you find something else that takes you in another direction altogether. And what I found out is that Sindonology has been somewhat under assault, especially in the last 10 years or so, and sometimes from some very unexpected sources. So that kind of turned around what my presentation was going to be today, and that's why it's in defense of Sindonology. And I'd like people here today and people who may, see the film of this to understand what's going on, because to somebody like me who's been around for so long, it's a very important thing. So for those who don't know this, the SEEC, which is hosting the conference, has asked its speakers to share their insights, perspectives, and opinions, and that's what you're going to get from me. And that doesn't mean you have to agree with my opinion. You may disagree with it. But that's the great thing about America, and it's a great thing about what Sindonology has always been. We've had a lot of different points of view. And, it shouldn't change the unity that we have in terms of what we believe in altogether. Okay, I want to just do a couple of definitions. So when I use the term, you know what I'm talking about. Excuse me? Authenticist. An authenticist is someone who believes that the Shroud of Turin is the genuine burial cloth of Jesus Christ. If I can ask the group here, you can just have a show of hands. How many of you consider yourself authenticists? So it's the large number of people in the room. And then we have medievalists, and these are the people who believe that the Shroud of Turin dates from the 13th or 14th century. And if I may ask at your peril, how many of you are medievalists? Who do we have to watch out for? Okay. But that's what I mean when I'm saying. And then we go on to Sindonology. And Sindonology is a term that's been defined in dictionaries since 1964 as the study of the Shroud of Turin. And this is what I want to emphasize. For we who have been involved with it for a long time, our interest in the Shroud is study. We do research. And it's made up of two units. etymologically, Sindon is, as someone mentioned earlier, that is taken from the Italian, and it means the Shroud of Turin. And ology, this is the important part, is the study of. I mean, you've seen it in psychology, and the people who are involved as Sindonologists are involved in the study of it. And so before we write, before we speak, we do quite a bit of research on it. And then what we do with that research is we turn that into knowledge, and then we disseminate the knowledge. And in many prior years, you would see the knowledge being disseminated by works of Sindonology. The sine qua non, or the essential element of Sindonology, is study. From 1939 to 1959, authenticist shroud research was called shroud studies. But in 1959, there was an organization formed called the Centro Internazionale di Sindonologia, and that's also known as the Turin Centro. And study is defined as the devotion of the time and attention necessary to acquire knowledge about the shroud. And the principal purpose of authenticist Sindonology has always been to disseminate factual knowledge about the shroud that has been acquired through study. Those who do that are called Sindonologists. And throughout the 20th century, Sindonologists usually publish their works in what we call works of Sindonology. And those are works that you used to be able to identify because they all had authoritative notes to them. You know, generally, as you're reading through the paper or the publication, there's footnotes, sometimes they're endnotes. And they always had a table of authorities or bibliography at the end, so you knew that the researcher was actually conducting research on this. Now, why I'm into the defense of Sindonology is I want to tell you that as a Sindonologist, I regard the term Sindonology as representing an enormous body of shroud knowledge which has been acquired and disseminated by dedicated Sindonologists, authenticists, and medievals alike over the course of the past 127 years. And as an authenticist Sindonologist, because I believe in the authenticity of the shroud, I regard authenticist Sindonology as the primary vanguard for the case for the shroud's authenticity and the primary bulwark against the case for the shroud's medieval origin. So the people who are on the other side, who are the medievalists, they're studying and they're writing and they're supporting their case against the shroud's authenticity. And if we were not there as Sindonologists doing our study, there would be no one that would be defending against that. So that's what I've been busy doing for the past almost 40 years now. Now, authenticists in Sindonology and Sindonologists, we belong to an unofficial shroud club. And the first rule of shroud club is you don't talk about shroud club. And meaning you don't talk about authenticist Sindonology. And there were a few exceptions to this rule. Barry Schwartz would occasionally break that rule, and he would come out and he would say things which were true. Sometimes they were a little bit stinging, but they were true. And that is that in Sindonology, there's sometimes a lack of collegiality, collaboration, and Barry wanted to see a lot more of that, but you don't see a lot of that in authenticist Sindonology. And Rex Morgan, who delivered keynote addresses at two different conferences, he would focus on the fact that Sindonology needs to recruit new people, needs to get new faces. And it's hard, especially today, to do that. There are not many people coming into it, and it's like society in general. You don't have too many people that want to really study and put the time into that. And so Rex would talk about getting a new wave of Sindonologists, and that's something that we're still striving to get. So I was kind of left with a predicament once I was doing my research on this, and that is that in order to defend Sindonology, I have to talk about Sindonology, so I have to break the first rule of Shroud Club. And that's what I'm going to do today. And what I found out in my research was about 10 years ago, a very well-known medievalist Sindonologist and a historian claimed that all authenticist Sindonologists were predisposed to establishing the Shroud's authenticity. And I don't doubt that there are a number of people who get involved in Shroud studies, especially those that are very faith-oriented, that kind of fit that description. But most of the real Sindonologists that I have known over the years did not become convinced of the Shroud's authenticity until after they studied for a period of years. Myself, I was studying for about 5 years when, after I considered all the evidence, I felt the Shroud was authentic. Barry himself often told the story that he went to Turin, he saw the Shroud, he touched the Shroud, and yet he did not make up his mind about the Shroud's authenticity for about 15 years or 17 years. And, you know, that's kind of an intellectual exercise. It's not an exercise of faith, but it's where you get all the evidence, and some of it's historical, and some of it's scientific. But, you know, you get the evidence, and it's like a case that you would have, and you've seen a case played out, and then as a juror, let's say, you have to make a decision. And so I think that the statement that was made by this medievalist historian was very presumptuous and unfair and fallacious. And I would say the same thing if we as authenticists were to say that every medievalist was predisposed against the Shroud's authenticity. I think, you know, they're entitled to the benefit of the doubt too. They're looking at some of the same evidence, and they're coming up with a different conclusion. So this hardly surprised me, the fact that somebody who is a staunch medievalist would make a statement like that and attack authenticist Sindonologists. But what really surprised me was that, and I did not know this until a few months ago when I was doing the research, that in 2019, the Turin Centro dropped the name Sindonology from its title. And it's now become, oops, something happened to that next slide. It's now become the Centro of Shroud Studies. And when they did that, at the time that they did that, they actually did an indictment against Sindonology, and you can find it on their website. And there are 5 counts in this indictment. The slides seem to be not quite in order here, but I'll go forward. And I was surprised to hear about this because this is 6 years ago. And yet I did not see this on Shroud.com. I did not see it in any issues of the BSTS newsletter. I didn't see it on the Shroud Science group where it was discussed. And you would kind of think that somebody in Sindonology, especially authenticist Sindonology, say, what is going on? What is the complaint about Sindonology? And so I thought that it was proper to go over those charges and to defend Sindonology, especially for somebody like me, because I do have a deep love and respect for Sindonology. And so I want to look at these charges and I want to examine them. Now, in count 1 of the indictment, it said that the Centro said it was removing the word Sindonology from its name because it was difficult, that's not it. It was dictated by the need to keep up with the changing sensibilities of the times. Now, quite frankly, I don't even know what that means. What are they? And what you find out about this Centro indictment is they don't explain anything. They just proclaim what it is that their opinions are. But I don't know what the changing sensibilities of the times are. And they said that they had to do that because if they used the word Sindonology, the term, they wouldn't be able to keep up with them. Then in count 2, they said the term Sindonology was difficult to understand and untranslatable. Now, I have to regard this term really as patent nonsense. For the past 66 years, the term Sindonology has been perfectly well understood, and it's been translated as the study of the Shroud of Turin. Nothing's changed about that. So I don't know who's having the difficulty. I don't know who couldn't translate it. But this is one of the statements that they've made. And then in count 3, they said, I don't have a slide for this one, they said that the term Sindonology is open to many misunderstandings. And here again, I don't know what that means because they didn't provide a single example of it. They didn't define what a misunderstanding was. And for me, I've been around for a long time in this, and it's always been understood that it's the study of the Shroud of Turin. It's not very complicated. I'm sorry, but some of the slides I have are not here. Okay. And then in the fourth count, this one really kind of blew my mind. It said that Sindonology, the term Sindonology, has become everything it did not want and should not be. That's a pretty broad charge. And again, I have no idea what it means. So I had to think about it. And what occurred to me, first of all, is I've never heard a authenticist Sindonologist make any kind of statement like this. I don't even know an authenticist Sindonologist who said a single pejorative word against the term Sindonology. But I gave it some thought, and I said, what could Sindonology have become that it did not want to be and it should not be? And the first reason I came up with, most logically, was that maybe there had been a substantial deterioration in the quality of the works of Sindonology. And so what I did in the months leading up to this is I looked at 20th century works of Sindonology and 21st century works of Sindonology, and I didn't find any kind of decline in the quality of the work. There's good papers, there's good writings, there's poor writings, but overall, the quality of works of Sindonology really didn't change. And then as I'm trying to figure out what the Centro could be talking about, I took to their website. And if you haven't looked at it, I would suggest you might want to, because I did not know this. I always thought the Centro was a pro-authenticity organization. But they have a mission statement now, and it says that their mission is not to be a defender of the authenticity of the Shroud, but to scientifically and critically address studies on the reality of the find. Now, do you get that word? The find is the Shroud. The find is the Shroud. It's as if they regard the Shroud as some kind of archaeological object that was found in a dig, rather than an object that first came to light, which was presented as the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ in the array, and it was publicly exhibited that way and venerated that way. Also on their website, this is a quote, "Shroud scholars are in fact researchers and experts who apply their methods and knowledge to the investigation of the find, not with the intent of certifying so-called authenticity, but with the aim of deepening characteristics and, where possible, its origin." So the Centro is encouraging scholars like myself who have believed in authenticity for more than 30 years to continue their scholarly research, not to deal with the Shroud's authenticity, but to deal with it as if it's an open question. And everyone's supposed to have that kind of neutrality about it. No matter what you've read, no matter what it's convinced you, you're supposed to be some sort of zombie and have an open mind to what's there. And certainly if I found something in the evidence that convinced me that the Shroud was not authentic, then I would change my mind and I would publish what my thoughts would be. So, since they do not want scholars to be dealing really with the authenticity issue, I came up with another possible reason of why they think that Sindonology has become something that it shouldn't be and doesn't want to be. And this was the other reason, that is that maybe they think that Sindonology is too overly obsessed with the issue of authenticity. So I thought, well, this must be a new development, and I was really sort of suspicious of that. There's been a lot of authenticity debate over the 1988 radiocarbon dating, and maybe it just went over the top for them. You don't know because they don't explain what it is that they say. So I said that I would take a look at the history of what Sindonology has been. So where does Sindonology start? If you ask the average Sindonologist, they tell you, well, Sindonology started with Secundo Pia and his photographs, but it really didn't. Secundo Pia published his photographs, and everybody looked at them. But what happened, there was a civil war going on in the church at that time between the conservative Catholic clergy and the progressive Catholic clergy, and the conservative clergy came out and they declared that based on what Pia had found in his photographs, the Shroud was authentic. And of course, that didn't sit well with the progressive clergy, and one of the clerks, his name was Ulysse Chevalier, he ended up publishing the very first Shroud study, modern Shroud study. And it was a memorandum written by a bishop, Darcy, from the 14th century, in which supposedly 30 years before this memo was written, an artist had allegedly said that he painted the Shroud. So the first Shroud study was precipitated over the issue of authenticity. And then the next Shroud study that came out was by this gentleman, Paul Vignon. And Vignon wanted to prove Chevalier wrong, so he published a theory that the image on the Shroud had been formed through an interaction of ammonia vapors that emanated from Jesus' body and the spices that were on the cloth itself. And for the next 123 years, to the present time, this has been the established pattern of Shroud studies. Some scholars publish in support of authenticity, and others in support of inauthenticity. And clearly, a resolution of the authenticity issue is what the study of the Shroud has always been about. So if that was the Centro's idea of why Sindonology had become what it shouldn't be, that was not a new development. That's been there all along. So I just did a little bit further research, and this is what I think we've really been dealing with over the years. We call it Sindonology, which is the study of the Shroud, true enough. But I think that most of what's been done is what I would call Sindon-authenticology. It's really the study of the authenticity of the Shroud. And so, for example, this fellow is Herbert Thurston. He's another progressive cleric, a colleague of Chevalier. And in 1912, he published saying that the Shroud was medieval and that it would be impossible for anyone to render an intelligible account of the Shroud's early history beyond wild conjecture. So what do you think happened on the authenticity side? Back comes Paul Vignon, and he publishes a hypothesis that he is looking at the face which was on the portrayals that they had of this icon called the image of Edessa, and he sees so many similarities between that portrayal and the face on the shroud that the shroud had, or that the image of Edessa had to be based on the shroud's image. And so, if you can date the image of Edessa back to the 6th century, which you can, then the shroud must be at least as old as the 6th century. And then came along Dr. Barbet in 1950, and he's pronouncing the shroud authentic because the wounds on its image are congruent with both modern medical knowledge and with scriptural passion narratives. But you see the pattern here? All these people you may have heard about, they're only publishing because of authenticity. You know, they're not talking about the color of the shroud or, you know, the history of where it might have been moved from place to place after it was known. This is all about authenticity, or what I call Sindon authenticity. And then you got to 1978, and Stirp was going to do its examination. And what was the great anticipation about in terms of Stirp's examination? It was the prospect that what they would find would either confirm authenticity or it would prove inauthenticity. That's what it was really about. And Stirp never directly addressed the authenticity issue, it didn't make any declarations, but it did make findings, members of it made findings, not the whole committee, that the image was not a painting. And remember, that's what Ulysse Chevalier had said he found in the memo. So again, that was an authenticity-directed issue. And then came along a couple years later, Walter McCrone, and he's looking at these sticky tapes that Stirp applied to the shroud, and he concludes the opposite. He concludes that both the blood and the image are the results of an artist, and the artist is a painter, and he's actually using a paintbrush, which is, 100% opposite of what the findings were of Stirp. Still talking about the shroud's authenticity. Then in 1978, Ian Wilson, he publishes an intelligible, although controversial, account of the shroud's early history, and he hypothecates that the shroud was once a historical icon of Jesus' face and also a legendary portrait of Jesus' face. What is Ian's reasons for doing it? He believes in its authenticity. He knows that it needs to have a history. He proves Thurston wrong because his account is intelligible. You can make it out. You understand what his reasoning is. You may not agree with all his proof, but that's what it was about. Move on to the next segment, and that's the radiocarbon dating tests. And again, what is the great anticipation about these tests? It's the thought, the prospect, that they're going to be able to come up with something that proves the shroud authentic. They get a 1st century date, or inauthentic, they get a medieval date. And from the time that they declared that they had come up with a 13th or 14th century date, then the authenticists came back, and they've discussed numerous ways of why that dating is wrong. And I think the most plausible challenges have been, because there have been many of them, is that the samples that were tested may either have modern repair materials in them, that's Joe Marino's theory, or more recently, that the carbon that was in there is excessive because Jesus' resurrection produced neutrons which were absorbed and they formed additional carbon counts. Now, I wouldn't blame the Chantreau after 30 years of listening to all this back and forth of saying, this isn't what we thought Sindonology should be all about. And maybe that's what they meant. But I have to believe that they should be a little bit more practical, because we're here at the invitation of the SEC, and believe it or not, whether they know it or not, they've pronounced on the authenticity issue. First of all, you go to the page for this conference, and you're going to find 2 videos by Barry Swartz, and he's made hundreds of them. But here's the 2 that are advertised for this conference. The first one is called, Is the Shroud Authentic? The second one is called, the Shroud of Turin, real or not? Are we getting a pattern here? I mean, could people, even over in Turin, understand what this is about? And so my opinion is, one of the opinions that I hold is it's crystal clear to me that were the authenticity issue to be minimized in the study of the Shroud, popular interest in the relic and scholarly interest in research would come to an abrupt and permanent end. And so I came to the conclusion that the Centro understands this too, and it's probably not an obsession with authenticity which is driving their conclusion. So I get to their final, this is the last thing that they said about it. It's the most stinging because they have no detail of anything else. They said that Sindonology is devolved into a discredited term because it has often masked amateurism. Sounds pretty bad, but they don't define amateurism. They don't give an example of amateurism. And so I had to do what a researcher would do. I went to the dictionary and say, what is amateurism? And it's the quality of being without adequate ability, knowledge, or fitness. And so it seemed to me that the Centro was charging that Sindonology had often masked a lack of adequate knowledge of the Shroud. And believe me, if that was true, if I thought that was true, I would agree with them on the criticism. I don't think Sindonology should be masking anything that smacks of amateurism, which is lack of knowledge. But I still couldn't figure out what it was talking about at that particular moment. And I go back to the SEEC again. They're the geniuses of the present Sindonology age. Because if you take a look at the SEEC's mission statement, it says that the organization is dedicated to the study and dissemination of knowledge about the Shroud of Turin. That's what it's always been about, study and the dissemination of knowledge. And then I continue to poke around, and I get to this website that's run, a blog site, that's run by one of the more notorious medievalists. And it was done in 2019, the exact year when the Centro made these statements. And this blogger was complaining about and giving examples of Shroud lectures that have been given in which there is information. Much of it is just not factual. A lot of it is just plain untrue. And to be honest with you, he highlighted 7 of these lectures. I never heard of any of them. That's how little I have to do with what is happening on the social media about it. But I thought, you know, there's no coincidences here. If he's complaining about amateurism in 2019 and the Centro is complaining about it at the same time, they must be talking about the same thing. So I went on an amateur hunt to see what I could find of what was out there. And what I found is that there's a movement that's been in existence for quite some time now. It's kind of paralleled what I do, which is Sindonology, and it's called Sindon evangelization and re-evangelization. And it goes back to 1978. And this priest, his name was Monsignor Giulio Ricci, he went to a conference that was being held in Turin in 1978. And he presented a paper. The name of it was called Evangelization and the Holy Shroud. And this is what Monsignor Ricci said. It would be legitimate to appeal to the Shroud as an instrument of efficacious evangelization for those who are far from us, meaning non-Christians, and a surprising means of re-evangelization for a de-Christianized world where the great majority has not been given a serious catechetical education. And so I think Ricci realized what a lot of us realize today, you see it more and more, and that is that you can get people's attention with the Turin Shroud. The proof is very convincing. I think, but it has to be convincing not just as a matter of faith, it has to be convincing as a matter of reason. It's got to be based on the academic subjects as well. It has to be based on science. It has to be based on history. It has to be based on the study of religion, theology. But it's not merely and solely a faith movement. And I think what's happened is, going back to 1978, there was a dichotomy that had happened at that time that nobody really recognized. There was Sindonology, and that's, as I said, the acquisition of study and decimation of knowledge of the Shroud. And then there was Sindon evangelization. That's the employment of the Shroud of Turin to effectuate and re-effectuate conversions to Christianity. Sindonology is an essentially academic activity. Sindon authenticology is essentially a religious activity. Now, Sindon evangelization initially conducted its activities through highly respected Christian organizations which were scrupulous about disseminating complete, true, and accurate Shroud information. In fact, I first learned about the Shroud through a calendar in 1986. It was published by the Holy Shroud Guild. So they won me over. That was perfect Sindon evangelization, and everything that was on that calendar was perfectly true. And I want, because of some comments I'm about to make, I want to make it perfectly clear that I'm a supporter of Sindon evangelization, as long as the activities are based on the dissemination of complete, true, and accurate information about the Shroud. Sindon evangelization cannot work against Sindonology. It will pull out the legs from Sindonology, and then all of our basis for arguing authenticity on the basis of intellect and knowledge will be gone. And I also want to make it perfectly clear, I got started a little late. I also want to make it perfectly clear that there are Sindon evangelists who absolutely tell the truth. They say it just the way it is. I think we have a guy talking at this conference, Jim Bertram. He always does that. Okay? So they're out there, and I think that those Sindon evangelists deserve the support of Sindonologists. But by the 1990s, those organizations withdrew from evangelization, and now that was being carried out by what we used to call Shroudies. You know, they were just Shroud enthusiasts. They, you know, some of them are here, some of them I've known for 30 years. But they don't get involved in the study of the Shroud. They wait to see what Sindonologists are going to say about it. Except some of these people, because they were more interested in Sindon evangelization, they started going to lectures. And they would say whatever it was. Some of it was true, some of it was false, some of it was just kind of twisted and exaggerated. And when they were saying things that were false, a lot of times it was from basic ignorance because they didn't study. You know, they get one book from 1978 on the history, and they think, I've read 6 pages, I know all about the history of the Shroud. Or, you know, they get something on the science, and they say, oh, that convinces me. And they don't know about anything else that's going on in science. And these people are going into churches, they're going before Christian audiences, and these people are very faithful, and they want to learn everything they can about the Shroud. And they see somebody go up there who pretends, literally pretends to be an expert, but they really don't. They're not an expert because they've never studied anything. And then they are telling the audience all these various things. So I just want to give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. And I think with the time of frittering here, I might go through this rather quickly. Excuse me for 1 minute. And I do want to say, I think these people are all acting in good faith. I think they're doing what they think is right and proper, but I just don't think that they're doing it right. So Again, Sindonology, I've mentioned what that is, and I distinguished it from Sindon evangelization. Now, this is a lecturer that I met back in the 1990s, and I didn't realize that he was going out and giving these talks. But here is what this person actually said. For example, and I'm in the field of history, which is what I know. He would go out and he would say the earliest legends of the Shroud are found in the writings of Eusebius in the 4th century. In fact, there's neither a historical text nor even a legend that says that the disciple Thaddeus, who was featured in the legends, presented a shroud in Edessa. In fact, Eusebius, who is discussed here, he never even mentioned that there was an image. So where does somebody come off, really, going out and telling facts like this to the faithful? He also said, in the middle of the 5th century, the image of Jesus changed, the plague struck Edessa, and the shroud was taken out and displayed in public, when in fact, not a one of those things happened. Not a one. So clearly the purpose of this lecture was not to disseminate factual information. It was to present the shroud as a more efficacious instrument of evangelization than it already was. And it's already a powerful, efficacious instrument of evangelization. It doesn't need their help. We don't need their help in Sindonology. You just tell the truth about it, and there's plenty of evidence there. It convinced me, and I know that it convinced many others. Now, what's happened is, where this has gotten worse, is the 21st century came, and now we've got websites, we've got blogs, we've got podcasts, we've got streaming, and now Sindon evangelization has expanded exponentially. And what happened is, they started posting these lectures to YouTube. And then other people started to see them. And by 2019, the Centro members were looking at these things, and the medievalist bloggers were looking at these things. They were both looking at the same thing. And when the medievalist blogger did his analysis that I had mentioned before, he said that these were being done by what he called popular evangelists. And they were so popular that I didn't know who they were, and I had been at this for 30 years, so I don't know where they were. They never came to conferences. They never debated anything. They never wrote anything. But he was saying, the blogger was saying, these are pseudo-experts. They get introduced as being experts. They're not experts at all, and then they just pretty much say anything that they want. They're so bad that the most popular of these, who's a pretty well-known figure, and like I said, I think the person's heart's in the right place, but they can't get the year right of when Secundo Pia took his photographs. They can't get the year right of the Chambéry fire. They can't even get the century right in terms of the century to which the shroud was dated by carbon dating. That's like somebody gets up and says they're an American history expert, and they can't tell you the year of the Pilgrim landing, the year of the Declaration of Independence. They can't even tell you the century of the Civil War. That's what is happening out there, and it's getting observed now. And to me, it was always, I don't know what these people were doing. I don't really care what they're doing. It's their business. They're in some other field. But it's now having an effect on Sindonology. It's making the real experts, the real students, look like fools. So much so, I wouldn't care if it was just the medievalists who we're talking about, but the Centro, who's supposed to be an, a authenticist leading organization, at least that's what the roots of it always was. They're saying that Sindonology is providing cover for these people. And I don't know where it is. I haven't seen that. Let's see if I can do a couple of quick slides here. One of the claims that this lecture had put was that he claimed that the radiocarbon dating laboratories had ignored an approved protocol that said there had to be 7 samples taken from 7 parts of the shroud. There was never such a protocol. And where he really got mixed up is that he apparently looked at the protocol discussions, and it was supposed to be 7 laboratories that were supposed to take the test at one time. So he can't tell the difference between 7 laboratories and 7 samples that have to be taken. And then he says that the samples that were taken was taken from an area of the shroud repaired by Poor Clare nuns. Now, the Poor Clare nuns did their repairs around the patches that were at another part of the shroud. So they were nowhere near the sample. But this is what you get. They are so scared of the 1988 radiocarbon dating, and there's plenty of good scientific reasons, plenty of good historical reasons to argue against it. But these are people who don't mind making things up because this sounds like, to your audience, you say, oh, well, I'm just throwing out the radiocarbon date because, after all, they took samples from where the Poor Clare nuns did repairs. And this other speaker said that the Hungarian Prey manuscript, that many of you are probably familiar with, had been radiocarbon dated to the year 1196. Well, it's never been radiocarbon dated. And it's dated to around from 1190 to 1195 because that's when the codex was published that the illustrations were in. But there's no carbon dating. So why is an expert to the shroud telling a group of people about this? Again, clearly the purpose is not to disseminate knowledge, but it's to maximize evangelization. This is what the blogger said. This is what we get from a medievalist. Real shroud experts would surely cringe with embarrassment in reviewing these lectures. I agree with them. I cringed when I saw them. And he says, with friends like these, the shroud suffers more than it ever does from enemies. I agree with that as well. I did get started late. I mean, the movie was only over at 8 o'clock. So, it's not just the shroud that suffers from this kind of amateurism. It's now Sindonology that's suffering from it, and that's why I'm speaking out about it. And I'll conclude with this, and then just tell you what I was going to conclude with. Amateurish Sindon evangelists have never called themselves Sindonologists or their activities Sindonology. No one has ever called their activities Sindonology or called them Sindonologists. They don't participate in debates with Sindonologists, and that's why most of us don't know even what they're talking about. And so the bottom line is, Sindonologists and Sindonology have never masked amateurism, and I don't get where the Centro is coming up with that statement. The last thing I'll say, and it was probably another 5 minutes, but my other concern that what's going on now, and you're seeing this, is that there are now websites out there. And they're being put out there by either Sindon evangelist organizations or by people that are of that nature. And they're putting in the same kind of false claims. I have them all listed and why they're wrong, at least on the historical side. And so I think what we have to do, we have to work together. I think that Sindonologists and Sindon evangelists have to work together. And we have to make sure that we're not acting contrary to the interests. Because we're not just here to win souls. I understand that. And we're not just here to win the academic debate. But both of those things are very important. And we have to be able to distinguish the two and to work together. Thank you.
I'd like to comment that the dark forces, Jesus said beware of false prophets. And the dark forces are intended to discredit anything that would bring the truth forth.
And we don't want to give them an ability to do that.
We are in an intersection of time where each individual has to find the truth within themselves.
Absolutely.